Hello again. It's me, Ian-Khara Ellasante. My pronouns are they and them, and I'm an assistant professor of gender and sexuality studies and Africana at Bates College. I'm glad to be your guide as we ponder the Maine Humanities Council big question of the year, what if? So in an earlier recording, I used Afrofuturism to help frame and to help us approach the question of what if and all of the potential that it contains. And in the most recent recording, I tried to set the stage for us to consider the question of what if there were no gender? And in doing that, I laid out some fundamentals of gender along with some questions to ponder. So I want to pick back up where we left off, the questions that I left you with. So let me screen share with you. All right, so the questions I left you with are, what do you think is the purpose of these systems of reward for gender conformity and punishment for gender nonconformity? How might systems like these have originated? Why do these kinds of systems persist? And in what ways do you think these systems harm or damage society as a whole? And of course, a tricky question, in what ways do you think these systems serve or benefit our society? And I also wanted you to think about these what if questions. So what if there were no gender in the ways we now know it? What would change in society? What would change in families, in religions, in healthcare, in education, et cetera, et cetera? What would we gain and what would we lose? What would we lose if we were to explore and establish a different system of gender? So let me stop. All right. So I hope you've been thinking about these questions. I have. I think about these questions a lot. I mean, it's sort of my job to think about questions like these, but also because of my own experiences with gender, I find myself pondering questions like these a lot. So, in thinking about what if there were no gender, I want to take a deeper dive into this question that I posed. What if there were no gender in the ways we now know it? So, as I discussed in the first recording, in reference to Afrofuturism as an exploration of what if, so much of thinking through these big or small what if questions requires us to not only imagine future scenarios, it also requires us to reimagine what we know or what we think we know of the past. So, imagining a world in which there is no gender, well, that means that we'd probably end up trying to figure out how we would have gotten ourselves to a place where there is no gender. So, what was the past that brought us to this point? In this imaginary world, is it that gender as we know it has simply never existed? Or maybe it did, but maybe our societies evolved away from it. Or maybe at some point it was just tossed out. We decided we didn't need it anymore. Or maybe in a more immediate way, we decided that gender as we know it was a useless and in fact harmful concept, and we simply just abolished the idea of it. But in any of these scenarios, rather than gender simply never existing or simply going away, I imagine that what we'd probably see is that there is some human constructed social system that is maybe not a gender system in the ways that we're familiar with gender systems, but it is something else. And maybe I'm being too much of a realist here and less of an optimist. But after all, as humans, we find all kinds of ways, both respectable and nefarious, of classifying and categorizing everything and everyone. And this becomes most problematic when hierarchies or systems of stratification overlay these categories. And that ensures that some have and will maintain more access to power and privilege than others. Now, we see this when it comes to race, sex, social economic class, citizenship, sexual orientation, age, religion. And of course, we see it in the ways that gender systems are systems of advantage for some and disadvantage for others. So, understanding that there may be a system of some type that replaces or substitutes for gender, I return to my question: what if there were no gender in the ways we now know it? So, to that end, I want us to explore some other ways of thinking about gender. Let's think differently about gender. One of the ways to think differently about gender is to give it more nuance. So, in 2014 and 2015, I developed this questionnaire for the University of Arizona's Southwest Institute for Research on Women, CIRO. And we'd had a series of grants working alongside and on behalf of LGBTQ plus young people. And based on feedback from these young people, we wanted to develop an instrument that would offer a snapshot of their gender in the ways that were most affirming to them. And that would, of course, also allow us to be able to measure change over time. And I kept hearing from the young people that I worked with that they wanted to move away from simple binary conceptualizations of gender. And so I came up with this instrument, which is at least a bit less binary and offers much more room for nuance. And so they could use this to designate, as you can see here, their gender identity and their gender expression, and then also their biological sex. And so this was called the Anchor Project Supplemental Questionnaire. And so they were able to, as you see the small boxes here, these are examples perhaps um, of what particular answers might look like. So they were able to designate gender identity, gender expression, and um, in in another set of questions just below these, also able to designate their sexual orientation in a couple of different ways. So this is just a simple and now 7.5-year-old example of how we can think differently about gender by allowing gender to be as nuanced and complex as it truly is. And this is a simple way to try to capture that nuance. Um, and surely it's better than a boring old binary. Another way to think differently about gender is to reinvite this idea of a spectrum. Remember last time, although I used the spectrum to talk about aspects of gender, remember this one? I explained that the spectrum, it still underscores a binary because the two extremes or the two poles um, represent a gender binary. But what about this? if the two extremes and the binary that they represent were less about how one identifies their gender or expresses their gender, and more about how one is currently experiencing their gender. So maybe something like this. So what we have here is a spectrum with gender euphoria on one end and gender dysphoria on the other end. And to just kind of provide a little context, so the Oxford American Dictionary defines euphoria as a feeling or state of intense excitement and happiness, and defines dysphoria as a state of unease or generalized dissatisfaction with life. Now, maybe you're familiar with the term gender dysphoria, which the Mayo Clinic defines as, quote, the feeling of discomfort or distress um, that might occur in people whose gender identity differs from their sex assigned at birth or sex-related physical characteristics, end quote. Okay, Mayo Clinic. But I like Susan Stryker's definition better, and that's what I have here. She writes that gender dysphoria is, quote, a sense of unhappiness over the incongruence between how one subjectively understands one's experience of gender and how one's gender is perceived by others. Mhm. But as long as we're dreaming and imagining a world in which gender as we know it does not exist, I want us to imagine that this spectrum is less about how others perceived you and simply about how you felt in yourself at any given moment. We could imagine that it might change based on context and circumstances. Um, so, for instance, I might feel a tremendous sense of gender euphoria while I'm at the skating rink, bopping along to Outstanding by the Gap Band. I mean, um, you know. um, but maybe I feel a hint of gender dysphoria when I notice in the mirror that my hair is not cooperating with my vision for my look for the day. And so, yes, both of these situations are social to some degree, but they have a lot more to do with how my experience of gender is feeling to me and less about how others are perceiving or interacting with my gender. Another way to think differently about gender is to complicate as many binaries as we can, especially those binaries that are directly associated with gender. Now, last time we talked a bit about complicating those boring old binaries that say that all humans are either female or male and either man or woman. Boring, yawn. These are basic and boring binaries, and we know that the human experience is much more complex than this. Well, there's another binary or false binary that is emerging and becoming more concretized as time goes on. And that is the binary of cis or trans, cisgender or transgender. Now, as you may or may not know, there is this idea that cisgender and transgender are opposites of each other. And when we look at the prefixes of these words, it seems like this is true. So cis means on the same side as, and trans means across or through. And I remember this vaguely from organic chemistry in undergrad in reference to molecules and the structure of different molecules. But on our topic, though, cisgender can be thought of as non-transgender because it's another way of saying that one's birth assigned gender aligns with, is on the same side as their current gender identity. Whereas with transgender, we are indicating that one's current gender identity does not align with the gender that they were assigned at birth. That for them, there has been some movement through or across gender, some movement away from their birth assigned gender. Now, on the surface, these definitions do make it seem like these two are opposites of each other. But as always, when we look at real lived human experience, we see that binaries of any type really just cannot stand, like they don't stand when we compare them to real human experiences. And so there are many human experiences of gender that show us that the lines between what it means to be cisgender and what it means to be transgender are, in many ways, pretty blurry. And finally, one more way, of many, many more, I'm sure, of thinking differently about gender is to imagine the full range of human experiences of gender as a sphere. Now, this is a major expansion and improvement upon the visual concept of gender as a spectrum. This sphere would have infinite coordinates because for every human being, there is truly a unique gender identity and gender expression. And this sphere would be able to encompass them all. And there would be no space for binaries because they simply don't make sense when we're thinking about a sphere. Um, Ideally, such an expansive way of thinking about gender would also mean, ideally, that we would have little use for social hierarchies based on gender, um, because the systems that, well, these hierarchies that reward conformity and that uh, penalize nonconformity, we wouldn't really have any need for them if we thought about gender in this way, because what is conformity when everybody's gender is recognized as valid and significant? So, with that said, I'll ask you, what about you? Which of these ways of thinking differently about gender most resonates with you? Um, Which of these ways of thinking differently about gender do you think moves us the furthest away from the harms of the current system of gender? Um, which make you think most about what we might gain by thinking differently about gender? So I'm looking forward to talking with you more about this at the upcoming panel. So thank you for listening, and I'll see you then.